Hello and welcome to the Driving It Home podcast, where I take spiritual lessons from Chris's weekly sermons and help to drive those points home, giving you and your family practical action steps, bonus takeaways, maybe a few laughs along the way. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But all designed to help you grow closer to the Lord. This week, Chris started a sermon series called Facing the Giants, which means we all got to hear about our favorite Bible story, or at least one of our favorite Bible stories, David and Goliath. I'm so excited to dive into this story, or should I say drive into this story? I don't know. Anyway, let's jump in with a brief overview of Chris's lesson. Chris reminded us we all have problems in our lives, and you already knew that, but we kind of noticed that some problems are different sizes, that we have different size problems in our life. We have these big old giant problems, and then we have the little tiny baby problems that are kind of sneaky and dangerous, and if we ignore them, can grow into these giant problems. But tying it into the story of David and Goliath, many times when we read that story or hear that story, we think that our job is to play the role of David and slay that giant in your life. But the truth is, many times we can't do that because, number one, we're not David, and number two, we're not powerful enough to overcome those giants on our own. But the encouragement that we Christians get from this story is that we serve a God who is all-powerful and is capable, and we serve a Lord who is all-sufficient to overcome and to slay those giants in our lives. And so the major takeaway from Chris's lesson wasn't that you should be the David in your own story, but that Jesus is, and Jesus has everything you need, and he has the authority, the willingness, and the power to slay whatever giant is in your life today. One of my favorite verses on the topic of overcoming the problems that we face in our life is from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, which Chris talked about in verses 9 and 10, where Paul says, "But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in a weakness. Therefore," Paul says, "I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And I want to focus on that last sentence, but I want to read it again because it sounds like a riddle. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Sort of a wax on, wax off kind of phrase. But what does it mean? What kind of weakness is he talking about? And how can these two statements be true at the same time? I'm weak and I'm strong. What does that mean? Well, the weakness he's talking about is obviously not a physical weakness. It's not, when you struggle to lift the weights that you're trying to lift for your workout or whatever. It's that weakness where it's relative to the size of the problem that you're facing. When you're too weak to overcome that problem that lies before you, that giant that is in your life. When I'm too weak and I recognize that weakness, hopefully for us Christians, it points us, it directs us and guides us towards reliance on the Lord's strength. And so it's not so much that when I have a weakness, then I am strong, but when I acknowledge my weaknesses, then I rely on the strength of the Lord. The power of Christ rests upon us, as Paul talks about earlier in these verses. So what Paul says is he's actually content with his weakness and his insults and his hardships and all these things he has to endure because it forces him to rely on the power of the Lord, and because the Lord is faithful to overcome those things on behalf of Paul. And so that's actually an encouragement and gets him reason to be thankful and content with his weaknesses and hardships, persecutions, and so on and so forth. So when I am weak and I acknowledge my weakness, then the Lord is powerful and faithful to be strong in that weakness. And that's really the point of what Paul is saying. So I want to give you an action step that you can take with you this week, and that will hopefully help you apply and implement this lesson into your life. I want you to take notice. This shouldn't be difficult because we're pretty well aware of what our weaknesses are. But I do want you to take time, write down a couple of the weaknesses that you have, some of the giants or the problems that stand before you in your life that you're facing right now. Write those things down and then thank God for them. Yeah, thank God for them, not because you're so grateful to have weaknesses and you're so grateful to have problems, but understanding that the value and the utility of those weaknesses and problems is that God can be glorified through your life. And that's something to give him praise and glory for. That's something to be grateful for. But then also, take note of something Paul says. He says, for the sake of Christ, then I'm content with weaknesses and insults. So don't just thank God for your weaknesses and your problems and those giants in your life, but actually pray prayer and ask him to give you contentment about these things. And that's hard because it's so tempting for us to be discontented when we acknowledge a weakness we have. Our life would be better, my life would be better if I didn't have this weakness. And nobody else has this weakness. It's just me, right? And we kind of want to hide it. We don't want to boast about it, certainly like Paul talks, but we want to hide it because if people see that we have a problem or a weakness, then that means we're not as perfect as we'd like everybody else to think that we are. So I want you to not only pray a prayer of gratitude to God for being strong in your weakness, but also ask him to help you to have a sense of contentment about those things as well, knowing that he is glorified through your imperfections. What a mighty God we serve. I hope that encourages you. You'll notice in the show notes or the details below this video or below this podcast, however you're listening or watching, that there's a PDF document. And we created that PDF as a supplemental resource for this supplemental resource. But it kind of on page 2, it gives you basically an overview of everything I just talked about, almost a transcript if you wanted to read it and go over it with your family. But then page 3 is a section called Table Talk. And so I'm not going to pretend like I have to decipher that code for you, but it's designed to have you and your family sit around the table and talk about some questions that we've outlined for you that specifically relate back to this lesson. So if you want to access those questions, those are on the PDF document here in the show notes. I hope you'll take the time to sit down with your family, talk about these questions, and just help your family to implement this spiritual lesson into your life this week. Hopefully it helps you drive it home. Anyway, that wraps it up for this week. Hope to see you next time on the Driving It Home podcast. Take care.